PATV presents Live from Prairie Lights, featuring the best authors and poets on the scene today. From up-and-coming to well-established writers from across the globe. You'll see them right here on PATV.
Good evening and welcome to Prairie Lights. I'm Elizabeth Cunningham. Tonight we're proud to welcome Simon Van Booy, who returns to read from the first 3 volumes in his edited series, Why Our Decisions Don't Matter, Why We Need Love, and Why We Fight. In his own stories, Van Booy writes with a large, generous conception of humanity and uses language to reflect the dealings of the mind's deepest associations. From works by Homer, Horace, Blake, Twain, Beckett, Borges, Rilke, and Shakespeare, these collections undertake the same scrutiny of human experience. In this series, Van Booy invites us readers into a collective reservoir of insight we can access and enhance. Simon Van Booy was born in London and grew up in rural Wales and Oxford. After playing football in Kentucky, he lived in Paris and Athens. He is the author of The Secret Lives of People in Love and Love Begins in Winter, which won the 2009 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. After the reading, we will be opening up for discussion questions. Simon Van Booy.
Thank you very much for coming, and it's lovely that we can spend an evening together tonight. I want to thank you also for a lovely introduction. I had to say rural Wales instead of just Wales because some people assumed that I came from the sea. So I think I've got the 3 books with me to read from, as you can see, and I'm going to read just a few extracts from each book, and maybe explain a little about how the books came to life. My wonderful publisher and I, Caricania, were in a bookshop, and we were in the philosophy section. And there were skeletons on the chairs, and there were skeletons on the skeletons, and there were these enormous books with titles like Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, and large on the covers. And we wondered, who comes into this section of the bookshop? Because when I was at college, anyone who studied philosophy was completely insane, and went on to have a very interesting life in and out of institutions, and became amazing ping pong players. Of course, if you've ever been into an institution, you'll know what I'm talking about. And so we thought, how wouldn't it be interesting if somehow we could enter this vast warehouse of world thought and shine a spotlight on things that we've read and things that I've come across at college and in my own time, and just put them together in under the umbrellas of a question. So the 3 books are Why Our Decisions Don't Matter, Why We Need Love, and Why We Fight. And they're 3 central questions that we thought might be interesting to people who are interested in philosophy and who are curious, but who may not have time to, read unabridged philosophical works. So I'll read the introduction from Why We, from the series, and then I'll read a little from Why Our Decisions Don't Matter, which seems to be the most interesting book to people so far. And incidentally, Why We Need Love and Why We Fight could have been the same book. Preface to the series. My hope for these books is to present interesting and exciting philosophical ideas in a straightforward but intelligent language that can be understood by everyone. I believe that philosophy is a subject we have a natural gift for, but a subject often regarded as one with no practical value, and closed to anyone outside the walls of universities. I am committed to the idea that these central questions of life are part of our everyday lives, that we all possess the skill and agility to tackle them, and that by pondering them we can experience more fulfillment in our relationships, in our work, and in how we view ourselves. Inside these books are readings, poems, quotations, and visual images that will inspire you to continue exploring the subject for years to come. I've tried my best to present philosophical ideas with no immediate resolution, as immediately accessible for everyday thinking. These volumes are not meant to convince you of anything, to be a definitive source, or to offer any new insights on a topic. Their purpose is simply to introduce you to an age-old theme that quite possibly has already taken a key role in your life. To begin then, let me tell you about a small statue I once saw in a New Orleans public park. The young man of marble who stood before me, discoloured by years of affection from birds, was holding a book to his heart with one hand, while using his other hand to pick a grape from a vine. If the grape were to represent life and the book over his heart knowledge, then one interpretation may be that book learning and actual life experience complement each other. So by reading about other people's experiences in this book, we may begin to understand ourselves with fresh insight. Reading reassures us that no matter how alone we might feel, there are many others, spread as wide as history itself, who have felt the same way we have, who have occupied the rooms we find ourselves locked in at various points in our lives. One celebrated aspect of literature is that unlike the ambitious exactitude of science, literature is often ambiguous, meaning that two people might have very different ideas about what a play, poem, or book is about. While at first this implied vagueness might seem detrimental to literature, it's one of its sustaining virtues, and allows people from different cultures and even different time periods to learn something about their own lives from a single story. If a story were viewed as a literal history, one could argue that it wouldn't be quite as useful, because history can easily be disproved, whereas story and myth are more like advice whispered to us by a wise grandmother. Many of the great geniuses who lived over the last 5,000 years were not writers at all, but oral storytellers who left it up to others to write down what they said. Stories, parables, and dialogues were their preferred method of teaching. In other words, instead of saying to a lazy child, "Go tidy your room now," our greatest thinkers would probably have begun with something like, "There was once a girl who never tidied her room." So, in Why Our Decisions Don't Matter, the book is broken up into several parts, which look at why what we think really doesn't have any lasting impact. And let me read you the very brief introduction to this. From the moment you wake up in the morning, there are decisions to be made. What should you eat for breakfast? What will you wear? What plans will you make for the weekend? Everyday decisions give us the idea that we're in control of our own lives. But there are also far more difficult decisions. Should you divorce your current partner? Should you take that job overseas? Should you own up to something and face the penalty, or live with a sense of guilt? Should you allow surgeons to operate on your child, or seek other, less invasive ways to fix a potentially threatening condition? In light of these more challenging decisions, the premise for this paradoxically titled book may seem at first to be utterly ridiculous, especially if we feel the fate of loved ones depends on us making what we perceive to be the right decision. This book is an introduction to a very old theme, and supposes that our tiny daily decisions about what to have for lunch are as utterly meaningless as those we perceive as critical to our lives and those in our care. I know that's a pretty intense introduction, isn't it? I hope When I sometimes I teach and this subject, and often my students come after class and they say, "Oh, I'm so depressed. Talk to me. I mean, how can this help me? I mean, now my decisions don't matter." One of the things I like to talk about at readings is also what didn't make it into the book. It's quotes and essays and pictures. But one person who thankfully did make it into the book is a philosopher called Epictetus. And I'll read his... the books begin with a writer's or a painter's or a philosopher's short biography. And I try to talk about things other than their accomplishments. I was at a funeral once of some great man who was he was a politician and a financier, and it was incredibly boring, and all his accomplishments were listed. I was like, what else could he do? Would it turn out that he was God as well? And then at the end, it was mentioned that and he loved butterflies, and he had books and books of them, and he stopped catching them when he was in his 40s and instead photographed them. Everybody was suddenly, wow, I didn't know that about him, wow. And there was a real rush of affection through the audience, and I sort of had the idea that when we die we're remembered for what we loved and not what we did. So I've since started buying books on insects. So Epictetus was born around 50 BC or BCE, and he was the sort of philosopher who valued usefulness above everything else. And he believed sincerely in helping people live more fulfilling lives through philosophy, through dialogue. And his common sense approach to ideas may account for his enduring appeal. He was born a slave, and his master was so impressed with his intellectual capability that he sent him to study in Rome. And then, when he went back, he was just so impressive that whoever his master, I say that word with all this irony, when his master, saw him after he'd come back from Rome, he thought, I can't keep this person here. And he said, go off into the world, you've got many things to achieve. And so Epictetus was emancipated. And he taught at a philosophical school that he opened on the northwest coast of Greece. And he lived and died there. In modern society, many people experience despair and unhappiness and worry over things that are simply not within their power to change. In The Art of Living by Epictetus, the idea is addressed that in some ways our decisions don't matter because so much of life takes place outside of our control. And so in the wonderful book, The Art of Living by Epictetus, each philosophical idea is one page. And it's so incredibly useful. I once had a student who was he was a star football player at the college, at the university. He was very, very unhappy. He was deeply unhappy. And he was a very interesting, sensitive man who was being forced to play a role. And so he really liked Epictetus. I think Epictetus helped him decide what he was going to do with his life. And this is one page from Epictetus. And if you don't like it, it's not my fault. Blame Epictetus. Happiness and freedom begin with a clear understanding of one principle. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. It's only after you've faced up to this fundamental rule and learned to distinguish between what you can and can't control that inner tranquility and outer effectiveness become possible. Within our control are our opinions, aspirations, desires, and the things that repel us. These areas are quite rightly our concern because they're directly subject to our influence. We always have a choice about the contents and character of our inner lives. Outside our control, however, are things like what kind of body we have, whether we're born into wealth or strike it lucky, how we're regarded by others and our status in society. We must remember that those things are externals and are therefore not our concern. Trying to control or to change what we can't will only result in torment. Remember, the things within our power are naturally at our disposal, free from any restraint or hindrance. Those things outside our power are weak, dependent, or determined by the whims and the actions of others. Remember too that if you think you have free rein over things that are naturally beyond your control, or if you attempt to adopt the affairs of others as your affairs, your pursuits will be thwarted and you will become a frustrated, anxious and fault-finding person. Another part of the book deals with our decisions not mattering because we're going to die. We have a mortal fate. And there's one section which focuses on vanitas paintings from the 17th century. And these paintings would have often a skull or some sort of fruit, or something that which, you know, would... what does fruit do when you leave it out?
Rods.
Yeah, rods, yeah. You see the mold, don't you? You think to yourself, should I still eat that? So these paintings remind us that, you know, of our mortal fate, and you know, as et in Arcadia ago, there's also a Latin term which reminds us that, you know, we're born to die, and so that section deals with that. Maybe a more interesting section that I could, for a reading, is the section that addresses the idea that our decisions don't matter until we realise they don't matter, and then they matter. Does that make sense? Reminds me of Frogger. Anyone ever play that game? I was a champion Frogger player with my brother, and then one day he was winning, and there was a power cut. And I swear that was divine intervention. He was never meant to be a champion Frogger player. To this day, we argue about that. He thinks I had something to do with it. Okay, so this section I'll read a poem by Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 to a prosperous family in Amherst, Massachusetts. The Dickinson house was alight with ambition, both legal and political. However, the world of her father was not one Emily took much interest in. She preferred gardening, baking, reading, playing the piano, and taking walks. Despite a single year at a female seminary and the occasional trip to Boston to see an optician, she barely left Amherst. When she died in her mid-50s, she left behind almost 2,000 poems, only a few of which were published during her lifetime. In the following poem, Dickinson encourages the reader to view himself or herself as someone completely unimportant and therefore free from a preconceived idea of self-worth. Once the reader is free from being somebody, he is free to enjoy the gentle beauty of wherever he is at that moment. If one has nothing, perhaps the only remaining luxury is freedom. In realizing that you are nobody and that your decisions don't matter, you're free to wander the world in awe of everything, unhindered by the need to make judgments or comparisons. Here's Emily Dickinson's poem. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name, the livelong June, to an admiring bog. And I think that poem is especially wonderful, I think, because it reminds us that anyone we feel we have to be is really our own feeling. And as the mythologist Joseph Campbell talks about when he mentions sacred space, finding a part of your day when you can be detached from how everyone sees you and you can just exist as an entity, free from demands. And that, he says, is a way of centering oneself. And so really I should be honest with you and tell you that the idea behind the book is that decisions don't matter until maybe we realize they don't matter. And then when we're free from the demands of, or as the, I think the Asian idea that you can only be free when you're not hindered by lust, fear, and social obligation. So once we realize that our decisions don't matter, we can start making decisions for what we really, really want to do in life. There was a man who didn't make it into the book called, I think his name was Bogdan Rajneesh. He was big in the 60s. I think he was famous for saying, Moses invests, Jesus saves, Rajneesh spends. And he was famous. I think John Lennon was a follower for a while, and he had all these yellow Rolls Royces, and eventually he was deported by the FBI when his followers, I believe, tried to take over a small town. I'm waiting now, people in cloaks will storm into the shop, and I'm to blame. But you know, he was really quite an intelligent person, and people would go and have an audience with him, and he'd come out and he'd address large groups of people. Apparently one person said to him, Rajneesh, my wife has been unfaithful to me. What should I do? And he said, he gave the strange answer. He said, this may be very painful to you. He said, but the question isn't, has she been unfaithful to you? The question is, has she been unfaithful to herself? So if I was him, I would think, well, both. You know. But I'm sure he meant that in a rhetoric way. So the last page of this book, ending these was quite difficult because I was worried that people would read them as a testament to what wasn't included, you see. So they became a book of what wasn't. You know, when you have a list, the 10 greatest, you know, novels of all our time, I mean, it's just, you know, it's difficult. It just causes arguing. So ending these books was quite difficult, quite challenging. But I found a wonderful quote to end Why Our Decisions Don't Matter. And it's from a Japanese Zen master who lived, he was born in 1686. And his name was Hakuin. So if anyone speaks Japanese, you'll realize that I can't. I'm completely mispronouncing his name. And this is his quote, translated into English, obviously. If you should have the desire to study Zen under a teacher and see into your own nature, you should first investigate the word shi, death. If you want to know how to investigate this word, then at all times while walking, standing, sitting, or reclining, without despising activity, without being caught up in quietude, merely investigate the koan, after you're dead and cremated, where has the main character, the chief actor of life gone? Then in a night or two, or at most a few days, you will obtain the decisive and ultimate joy. It took me more than a few days, it took me a couple of weeks actually, but then I was very distracted, and it's really quite a wonderful quote. The next book I'll read from is Why We Fight. One of the reasons from my very limited research, and I once called my editor Carrie at 1 o'clock in the morning to read her something, and she doesn't sleep. I mean, it's quite bizarre. And she picked up, and you can see who's calling now, can't you? So when people say hello, it's they're lying. They know who you are because they can see your number. And it's when you call people and say, "Were you asleep?" They'll never say, "I was." They'll say, "Oh no, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. Of course I wasn't." But I called her and I said, "This is amazing. You've got to hear this." And she said, "Why are you working on this book in the middle of the night?" And I said, "Well, this could become my life's work." And she said, "Don't let it, because we have to publish it in 6 months." One of the reasons, so I had a limited time to do research and to draw on what little I'd read before. But one of the reasons I found that maybe we fight is because of pride. And I think this was certainly a major theme in ancient literature. You know, the Greeks had their hubris, and in the Torah and the Quran too, pride and arrogance are really major themes and the cause of much destruction and unhappiness. And this is a bizarre little story by a monk. Let me read it to you. And he's talking about some, I don't know, you'll get it, I'll just read it. I would like to tell you a story from my country. A young man went off to war, leaving his pregnant wife behind. 2 years later, he was able to return home, and the young woman went with their son to meet her husband. They cried together out of joy. In Vietnam, in our tradition, when an event of this kind takes place, it has to be announced to the ancestors. So the young father asked his wife to go to the market to buy the things that are needed for the offering that is placed on the altar to the ancestors. Such an altar is found in every house. Each morning we burn a stick of incense to our ancestors on this altar, and in this way we make a connection with them. Burning this incense, adorning the altar with photographs of our ancestors, and dusting the shrine off are very important gestures. These are moments in which we come in contact with our ancestors. There are people living in the world who are completely uprooted because they do not practice such a turning toward their ancestors. So the young wife went off to the market. During this time, the young father was trying to convince his child to call him daddy. The little boy refused. "Mister," he said, "you're not my daddy. My daddy is somebody else. He visits us every night, and my mommy talks to him every night, and very often she cries with him too. And every time my mommy sits down, he sits down too. And every time she lies down, he lies down too." After he heard these words, the young father's happiness entirely evaporated. His heart turned into a block of ice. He felt hurt, deeply humiliated, and that's why when his wife came home, he would no longer look at her or speak a word to her. He ignored her. The woman herself began to suffer. She felt humiliated. When the offering was placed on the altar, the young father burned the incense, recited the prayers to the ancestors, and did the 4 traditional prostrations. Then he picked the mat up instead of leaving it there for his wife, so she could do the 4 prostrations in her turn. In his mind, he thought that she was not qualified to present herself before the ancestors, and she was humiliated by this. After the ceremony, he didn't stay at the house to eat, but went to the village and spent the day in a bar. He tried to forget his suffering by drinking alcohol, and he did not come home or back to the house until very late at night. The following day it was the same thing, and this went on for several days in a row. The young woman couldn't take it anymore. Her suffering was so great that in the end she threw herself into the river and drowned. When the young father heard this news, he returned to the house, and that night he was the one who went to get the lamp and lit it. Suddenly the child cried out, "Mister, mister, it's my daddy, he's come back," and he pointed to the shadow of his father on the wall. "You know, mister, my father comes every night. Mommy talks to him and sometimes she cries, and every time she sits down, my daddy sits down too." In reality, this woman had been alone in the house too much, and every night she talked to her shadow. "My dear one," she said, "you are so far away from me. How can I raise my child all by myself? You must come back home very soon." She would cry, and of course every time she sat down, the shadow would also sit down. Now the husband's false perception was no longer there, but it was too late. His wife was already dead. A misperception is something that can destroy an entire family. The Buddha told us a number of times that we are subject to misperceptions in our everyday life. Therefore, we have to pay close attention to our perceptions. There are people who hang on to their misperceptions for 10 or 20 years, and during this time they continue to suffer and make other people suffer. Why did the young father not want to talk this thing over with his wife? Because of pride. That's nice, isn't it? What I learned from my reading was not to take. I think I was just taking too many things literally, and so the idea of death, not so much being a physical death, but being some other another kind of death. Another way that fighting is addressed is poverty. Is the idea that we fight simply for need. And so there was I found an interesting quote by Albert Schweitzer from his book Memoirs of Childhood and Youth, and this is the quote. Very little of the great cruelty shown by men can really be attributed to cruel instinct. Most of it comes from thoughtlessness or inherited habit. And a quote from Aurelius, Marcus Aurelius, "Poverty is the mother of crime." One quote that didn't make it into the book was Maya Angelou, who said, "Society gets the criminals it deserves," which I quite like. Shoplifters at Saks. I'd like to read a longer extract, not the whole extract, but a bit longer than I've been reading, and it's a half of chapter 8 from Oliver Twist, and it's the scene where, I mean, many, myself included, many of you may not have visited Charles Dickens since high school or college, and it's really quite interesting. When I started to read the classics again, I was just, I mean, the themes and it was really a rich experience. So if you'll permit me, I will read a scene where Oliver Twist, after escaping and walking to London, meets the Artful Dodger. You know, Charles Dickens was very interesting, I have to tell you. He, when he was a child, when he was 12, his father went to prison for non-payment of debts, and I think if there was that law today, we'd probably all there'd be more people in prison than out of it. He had to go work in a shoe polish factory for 10 hours a day when he was 12, and I think that really was key to his development as a writer. It's interesting as well, I think when his father came out of prison, his mother said, "Well, you're there, you may as well continue working." Chapter 8. Oliver walks to London. He encounters on the road a strange sort of young gentleman. Oliver reached the stile at which the bypath terminated, and once more gained the high road. It was 8 o'clock now. Though he was nearly 5 miles away from the town, he ran and hid behind the hedges, by turns till noon, fearing that he might be pursued and overtaken. Then he sat down to rest by the side of the milestone and began to think, for the first time, where he had better go and try to live. The stone by which he was seated bore in large characters an intimation that it was just 70 miles from that spot to London. The name awakened a new train of ideas in the boy's mind. London, that great large place. Nobody, not even Mr. Bumble, could ever find him there. He'd often heard the old men in the workhouse too say that no lad of spirit need want in London, and that there were ways of living in that vast city, which those who'd been bred up in the country parts had no idea of. It was the very place for a homeless boy who must die in the streets unless someone helped him. As these things passed through his thoughts, he jumped upon his feet and again walked forward. He had diminished the distance between himself and London by full 4 miles more before he recollected how much he must undergo ere he could hope to reach his place of destination. As this consideration forced itself upon him, he slackened his pace a little and meditated upon his means of getting there. He had a crust of bread, a coarse shirt, and 2 pairs of stockings in his bundle. He had a penny too, a gift of sour berries after some funeral in which he had acquitted himself more than ordinarily well, in his pocket. A clean shirt, thought Oliver, is a very comfortable thing, and so are 2 pairs of darned stockings, and so is a penny. But they're small helps to 65 miles walking winter-time. But Oliver's thoughts, like those of most other people, although they are extremely ready and active to point out his difficulties, were wholly at a loss to suggest any feasible mode of surmounting them. So after a good deal of thinking to no particular purpose, he changed his little bundle over to the other shoulder and trudged on. Oliver walked 20 miles that day, and all that time tasted nothing but the crust of dry bread and a few draughts of water, which he begged at the cottage doors by the roadside. When the night came, he turned into a meadow and, creeping close under a hayrick, determined to lie there till morning. He felt frightened at first, for the wind moaned dismally over the empty fields, and he was cold and hungry and more alone than he'd ever felt before. Being very tired with his walk, however, he soon fell asleep and forgot his troubles. He felt cold and stiff when he got up the next morning, and so hungry that he was obliged to exchange the penny for a small loaf in the very first village through which he passed. He'd walked no more than 12 miles when night closed in again. His feet were sore and his legs so weak that they trembled beneath him. Another night passed in the bleak, damp air, made him worse. When he set forward on his journey next morning, he could hardly crawl along. He waited at the bottom of a steep hill till a stagecoach came up, and then begged of the passengers on the outside, of whom were very few, but who there were very few who took any notice of him. And even those who took notice told him to wait till they got to the top of the hill, and then let them see how far he could run for a halfpenny. Poor Oliver tried to keep up with the coach a little way, but was unable to do it by reason of his fatigue and his feet. When the outsides people saw this, they put their halfpence back into their pockets again, declaring that he was an idle young dog, and didn't deserve anything, and the coach rattled away and left only a cloud of dust behind. In some villages, large painted boards were fixed up, warning all persons who begged within the district that they would be sent to jail. This frightened Oliver very much, and made him glad to get out of those villages with all possible expedition. In others he would stand about the inn-yards and look mournfully at everyone who passed, a proceeding which generally terminated in the landlady's ordering one of the postboys who were lounging about to drive that strange boy out of the place, for she was sure he had come to steal something. If he begged at a farmer's house, 10 to 1, but they threatened to set the dog on him, and when he showed his nose in a shop, they talked about the beadle, which brought Oliver's heart into his mouth, very often the only thing he had there for many hours together. In fact, if it had not been for a good-hearted turnpike man and a benevolent old lady, Oliver's troubles would have been shortened by the very same process which had put an end to his mother's. In other words, he would most assuredly have fallen dead upon the king's highway. But the turnpike man gave him a meal of bread and cheese, and the old lady, who had a shipwrecked grandson wandering barefoot in some distant part of the earth, took pity upon the poor orphan, and gave him what little she could afford, but more, such kind and gentle words, and such tears of sympathy and compassion, that they sank deeper into Oliver's soul than all the suffering she had ever undergone. Early on the 7th morning, after he'd left his native place, Oliver limped slowly into the little town of Barnet. The window shutters were closed. The street was empty. Not a soul had awakened to the business of the day. The sun was rising in all its splendid beauty, but the light only served to show the boy his own lonesomeness and desolation, as he sat with bleeding feet covered in dust upon a doorstep. By degrees the shutters were opened, the window blinds were drawn up, and people began passing to and fro. Some few stopped to gaze at Oliver for a moment or two, or turned round to stare at him as they hurried by, but none relieved him or troubled themselves to inquire how he came there. He had no heart to beg, and there he sat. He'd been crouching on the step for some time, wondering at the great number of public houses, gazing listlessly at the coaches as they passed through, and thinking how strange it seemed that they could do with ease in a few hours what it had taken him a whole week of courage and determination beyond his years to accomplish, when he was roused by observing that a boy, who had passed him carelessly some minutes before, had returned, and was now surveying him most earnestly from the opposite side of the way. He took little heed of this at first, but the boy remained in the same attitude of close observation so long that Oliver raised his head and returned his steady look. Upon this, the boy crossed over, and walking close up to Oliver said, "Hello, me covey, what's the row?" The boy, who addressed this inquiry to the young wayfarer, was about his own age, but one of the queerest looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy enough, and as dirty a juvenile as one would wish to see, but he had about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was short of his age, with rather bow legs and little sharp, ugly eyes. His hat was stuck on the top of his head so lightly that it threatened to fall off every moment, and would have done so very often if the wearer had not a knack of every now and then giving his head a sudden twitch, which brought it back to its old place again. He wore a man's coat, which reached nearly to his heels. He'd turned the cuffs back, halfway up his arm, his hands out of the sleeves, apparently with the ultimate view of thrusting them into the pockets of his corduroy trousers, for there he kept them. He was, altogether, as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 4 feet 6, or something less, in his bluchers. "Hello, me covey, what's the row?" said this strange young gentleman to Oliver. "I'm very hungry and tired," replied Oliver, the tears standing in his eyes as he spoke. "I've walked a long way. I've been walking these 7 days." "Walking for 7 days," said the young gentleman. "Oh, I see. Beak's order, eh?" But, he added, noticing Oliver's look of surprise, "I suppose you don't know what a beak is, my flash companion." Oliver mildly replied that he'd always heard a bird's mouth described by the term in question. "My eyes, how green!" exclaimed the young gentleman. "Why, a beak's a magistrate, and when you walk by a beak's order, it's not straightforward, but always going up, never coming down again. Was you never on the mill?" "What mill?" inquired Oliver. "The mill? What mill? Why, the mill. The millers takes up so little room that it'll work inside a stone jug, and always goes better when the wind's low with people than when it's high, because they can't get workmen. But come," said the young gentleman, "you want grub, and you shall have it. I'm at a low water mark myself, only 1 bob and a magpie, but as far as it goes, I'll fork out and stump. Come on, up on your pins. Come on now, come on, Maurice." Assisting Oliver to rise, the young gentleman took him to an adjacent chandler's shop, where he purchased a sufficiency of ready-dressed ham and a half-quartern loaf, or as he himself expressed it, a 4-penny bran. The ham being cleaned and preserved from dust by the ingenious expedient of making a hole in the loaf by pulling out a portion of the crumb and stuffing it therein. Taking the bread under his arm, the young gentleman turned into a small public house and led the way to a tap room in the rear of the premises. Here a pot of beer was brought in, by direction of the mysterious youth, and Oliver, falling to at his new friend's bidding, made a long and hearty meal, during the progress on which the strange boy eyed him from time to time with great attention. "Going to London?" said the strange boy when Oliver had at length concluded. "Yes." "Got any lodgings?" "No." "Money?" "No." The strange boy whistled and put his arms into his pockets as far as the big coat sleeves would let them go. "Do you live in London?" inquired Oliver. "Oh, I do when I'm at home," replied the boy. "I suppose you want some place to sleep tonight, don't you?" "Oh, I do, indeed," answered Oliver. "I've not slept under a roof since I left the country." "Well, don't fret your eyelids on that score," said the young gentleman. "I've got to be in London tonight, and I know a spectable old gentleman as lives there what will give you lodgings for nothink, and never ask for the change. That is, if any gentleman he knows introduces you. And don't he know me? No, not in the least. By no means. Certainly not." The young gentleman smiled, as if to intimate that the latter fragments of discourse were playfully ironical, and finished the beer as he did so. The unexpected offer of shelter was too tempting to be resisted, especially as it was immediately followed up by the assurance that the old gentleman referred to would doubtless provide Oliver with a comfortable place without loss of time. This led to a more friendly and confidential dialogue, from which Oliver discovered that his friend's name was Jack Dawkins, that he was a peculiar pet and protégé of the elderly gentleman before mentioned. Mr. Dawkins' appearance did not say a vast deal in favour of the comforts which his patron's interest obtained for those whom he took under his protection, but, as he had a rather flighty and dissolute mode of conversing, and furthermore avowed that among his intimate friends he was better known by the sobriquet of the Artful Dodger, Oliver concluded that, being of a dissipated and careless turn, the moral precepts of his benefactor had hitherto been thrown away upon him. The extract continues to when Oliver meets Fagin, that wonderful and very complicated man who takes care of those children. I think we're going to. I'd like, if you have any questions, I'd like to take them. But the last quote I'll read from this is by Walt Whitman. I think it speaks for itself. I think one word would explain this silence. Bookmarks. I should get some, shouldn't I? And this is from There Was a Child Went Forth by Walt Whitman. There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became. And that object became part of him for the day, or a certain part of the day, or for many years, or stretching cycles of years. So thank you very much, and I'd love to take questions if anyone has any.
Please allow us to mic you for the questions so that they'll be audio streamed.
Do you really think it doesn't matter what we decide?
Actually, I think it's the most important question. I think the opposite of what the book. But to get to that premise, I had to realise that a lot of the decisions I was worried about making, or worried about the way I was worried about failing, didn't really matter. If that makes any sense.
This is going to sound like a weird question, but...
That's great, I like weird.
You mentioned that, I guess you mentioned kind of drawing upon a couple Asian philosophers, and I was just wondering in your book about decisions if you ever came upon the Hindu concept of karma yoga, and just like the idea of like who is the actor and dharma and that kind of thing.
You know, I didn't, but Asian philosophy and religion is something that I become so interested in pursuing. You know, I read about other writers who sort of dive off this cliff and they disappear. They go to Japan for 5 years, they go to China for they disappear, and then they come back, strangely feeling this thing called happiness, which so it's very interesting. Yoga I would love to pursue a bit more, I did it once. It was. I don't think I was doing it properly, because I fell asleep. I was so tired, and I fell asleep, and the instructor just let me sleep. But I have friends who do yoga, and I think it's really something that I'd like to do. Do you do yoga yourself?
I guess in the term karma yoga, it's not so, I mean, it can refer to like actual physical movements, but it's more like the idea of training your actions or disciplining your thought about actions so that you don't see yourself as really acting or making decisions, but like you believe that the absolute is kind of making the decision. So it's not like yoga, like I'm gonna take Pilates, like that kind of thing.
I see. Yeah, that's something I think I want to investigate. It's very interesting.
When you were reading Dickens, did you find yourself reading it as much for the rich language?
I did. It's more difficult to read than I ever thought, because I feel like I'm reading a contract. You know, the language from that period, and we're not reading translations when we read Dickens. Yeah, the language is quite wonderful, and the humour, and the very long sentences. What's interesting is that I think that it really has lengthened my attention span reading Victorian books. I mean, what did they do? They stared at the fire, or went out and said hello to the horses, looked at their dresses, or...
How did you find that monk story and how we fight? And more generally, how do you find the material that you decide to include in the books?
Very good question. Actually, when I give readings, people will suggest things, and probably 25% of the books has come from books that were sent to me or books that people gave me. That I'm just so grateful. Like, I will investigate this, and I will find a way of flying through the air in some strange Eastern mystical way and appearing at your window. So I'm warning you of this now. Don't call the police, it's just me. But Hafiz, who is a Persian poet, I mean, somebody gave me a book. It just said Hafiz on it, and I thought, oh, what's this? Bizarre. And then I read it, and I was just really captivated by the simplicity of feeling. I think one of his lines is, between your eye and this page is me, which is quite nice. And I think he lived he was a contemporary of Geoffrey Chaucer, so he lived in, I think, the 14th century. But it's exactly that from people. And through, just through accident, looking in used bookstores and finding things, and I tried asking decorated professors, but they didn't return my emails. I think that people who have a passion for a book or a story means more to me than something which is supposed to be good. Do you see what I mean?
It sort of seemed like you, you hinted at in why our decisions don't matter, that the title is like posing a question, and when you were looking for material, you sort of made certain discoveries while doing that, and you're not necessarily trying to impose them upon the reader. But could you tell us like what discoveries you made in the other two, the Why We Need Love or Why We Fight?
Yeah, I can, because they're quite embarrassing, so I shouldn't really, I'll tell you, but as long as no one's listening on the radio. But Why We Need Love was difficult. And I stumbled upon something that, I couldn't figure out. The book was missing something. And everyone said it, my editor, my wonderful publisher, Caricania, friends, they said it's missing something. And it sounds like I should have had a great time doing the research for Why We Need Love. Can you imagine the things I'd get to put on an expense account? But it was very difficult, and I realized at the end that maybe that you might be a very loving person, and you might be able to give love. You might be caring and generous. you can't receive love, it's not going to work. It's one thing to give love, but half of, the other side of the coin is that you've got to be able to accept it. So that's one thing I discovered. So my advice to you is, when somebody says they'll make the coffee in the morning, let them.
I was paging through your book before you came, and I saw a section on Sartre, and existentialism and essence. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I would love to. A friend of mine was babysitting a few months ago, and to two boys, one age 8 and one age 12, and they were sleeping in bunk beds. And she heard some noise coming from their bedroom, and she went in, and the 8-year-old boy was tossing and turning, and in his sleep he was saying, "I want to be someone else. I want to be someone else. I want to be someone else." And she thought, "Oh my God, he's having an existential crisis." At aged 8, so she tried to remember her existentialism and humanism from college. And when the parents came home, she said to I think it was her brother, she said, Thomas, I've got to talk to you. Thomas is having some kind of identity crisis. In his sleep, he was saying, "I want to be someone else," over and over again. And his father said, "Oh no, that's his video game. Whenever he tries to choose a character, the button sticks, and it drives him crazy." And so that's sort of my way of trying to sort of illustrate how I have such massive problems understanding ideas of existentialism, especially the work of Sartre. But I did include some in the book from an essay he gave, where he talks about the idea of bad faith and the idea it's so very difficult for me to explain. Why don't I read to you a 6,000-page extract? Hold on. That's a very good question because I can't answer it.
Probably have time for one more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Quotes of ours when you get the some of these websites that have like a express popping up here with the quotes, they're quite good.
Right, exactly.
Some of them.
Yeah, it's a good resource.
Just like K-E-N-D-A-L. Do you ever have the candy? Candle mint cake?
Simon, I got a road. Michael Plum.
Nice to meet you. How you doing?
Peggy's brother.
Yeah, how's it going?
Nice to see you. She'd kill me if I didn't say hello.
I'm glad you did. It was nice to see you.
Nice to see you. We sing together.
Hello, public access television. Without public access television would be obnoxious.
I go, no.
It's really the truth.